turn to our guests, just a couple of quick updates about what's happening more broadly. Each week we've been talking about what's happening on Capitol Hill and the prospects of one more wave of stimulus or relief funding. There was some major developments this week, including the introduction of a new piece of legislation, the Save Our Stages Act, which was introduced by Amy Klobuchar from Minnesota and John Cornyn from Texas. This is a $10 billion, essentially a grant fund targeting venues to help replace lost revenue in 2020 with the potential of additional funding down the pike. That goes alongside the Restart Act introduced by Senator Bennett from Colorado as a potential vehicle that we may see coming out of the stimulus package, which we anticipate will be passed late in the evening or early in the morning, right around August 7th, August 8th, right around there before Congress goes away for the summer. So important developments there. Again, if you have not had an opportunity to weigh in with your congressional delegation, please do so. If you have questions about how to do that, there are a lot of resources. We'll be talking about some other advocacy efforts later today. But this is, if you haven't had a chance to do it, this is the moment. It's really important that we all make sure that Congress knows if they're spending $1 trillion or more to help support the economy, that music has to be a major part of that. So with that introduction, I'm going to bring in Dani Grant and our first guest today, Nick Forster from eTown in Boulder, Colorado, who are joining us. And Dani, why don't I go ahead and let you introduce Nick and start this conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. So excited to have you on the program, Nick. And, you know, I just appreciate being able to bring your perspective in, you know, having toured worldwide for 12 years or more, you know, and having that perspective as a musician, as a producer, as an industry professional, as a venue owner and manager from eTown Hall there in Boulder. I think that your perspective is going to be just a wonderful way to share with our guests some of the knowledge that you have. And so thank you so much for joining us. And I will say that I owe you another little thanks. Back in 2009, I went to a show in Fort Collins, your Loretta Lynn show, eTown program. And afterwards, you had a good discussion with my father that prompted him to lend me some money to do my first showcase at South by. So I owe you for that. Thanks so much. That was a good long time ago. But yeah, so with that, I'm hoping you can share a little bit more. I mean, I know eTown very well, but there might be some people out there who aren't aware of that program and just how it intersects with music and sustainability and environment and all those things. Could you share some more about eTown with us?
Sure. Just a little bit of background. I've actually, you know, I started touring with Hot Rise in 1978. So it's actually 42 years since I've been a touring musician. And was, as you mentioned, lucky to get to play all over the place and make a bunch of records and do all kinds of things. But it really gave me a very clear sense of the ecosystem of performance venues, from the earliest bars and pizza parlors and restaurants and college gigs to slowly getting to play theaters and festivals and graduating to where we could, you know, play really good gigs in almost any city and travel all over the world. It was awesome. And along the way, I got exposed to media by playing on the Grand Ole Opry or Austin City Limits or, you know, various Prairie Home Companion, Mountain Stage, lots and lots of radio shows and TV shows. And sort of in around 1990, Hot Rise had pretty much done what it set out to do, and I was looking for another opportunity. And I wanted to combine my values and my concerns as a parent of 3 kids, 3 daughters, with my skills and talents as a musician and as a sort of front person. I was a spokesperson for Hot Rise. And having done a lot of radio and TV and stuff, I just thought, well, wow, I want to start a radio program that will be mixing live music performances from some, you know, world-class artists, but also introducing discussion around how we treat each other and how we treat the planet. And those were the things that were important to me. And I can tell you that I was met with lots of derision and discouraging comments from program directors and funders and all kinds of people, including National Public Radio at first. But if you do anything long enough, and if you get better at it, you'll find an audience. And so eTown launched in 1991 with about 40 radio stations. We now have about 300 radio stations that carry the show every week. And about 10 years ago, or 12 years ago, we bought an old church in downtown Boulder, 17,000 square foot building. It was in pretty rough shape, and spent millions of dollars renovating it and turning it into a great facility for us to tape our shows, but also as a recording studio and offices and community spaces. And our our trajectory was pretty solid and pretty steady. And what's so interesting about this moment, the COVID moment, is that even though we have a global audience, we make videos, we make podcasts, we make radio shows, we do all this stuff. I think we're over 1 million views a month on our YouTube channel. We've got lots of podcast subscribers. We've got people listening to the show from all over the world. But we've been making our shows and capturing our shows in front of a live audience all these years. And starting in March, we couldn't do that anymore. So what's so interesting to me is, as a performer, this is the longest time I've not been on stage in many decades. And that's weird, just to not be on a stage. And it's also weird to have this beautiful facility that's dark. And so there's nothing going on at eTown Hall. So what's interesting about my world, I guess, are three things that are sort of, different about eTown. One is we've always been about more than just the live event and live venue and the flow of ticket revenue that sort of drives the business. We've always sort of had this two-headed beast where we have live events in our venue and we capture our shows in front of a live audience, but we also are a media making company. So we are still making media. We just have to pivot and figure out a new way to do that. So that's one advantage that we have, frankly, over a lot of other venues that have had to shut their doors and literally don't have either the infrastructure or the team or the equipment or the experience or the audience that's already established to continue to utilize their facility on behalf of creating shows and music for an audience. The second piece that I think is interesting is that the shutdown is forcing all of us to rethink and pivot and think about how we do what we do and challenge our assumptions and get out of our comfort zone. And the comfort zone is gone. So that's not an option. So to get out of our comfort zone and really think about what are our skills, what are our gifts, our talents, our interests, how can we serve our community in a way that's that we're uniquely suited to do. And then the third piece is the social moment that we find ourselves in, where those assumptions about us being inclusive and respectful also are getting challenged. And so that's making us all think about the content we create, the shows we produce, the artists we welcome, the conversations we initiate in our communities. So in those respects, in the midst of the absolute crisis that we're facing, as literally millions of people are out of work and their jobs that they had don't exist anymore, and all the venues that we know and love and places where we've seen amazing performances are shuttered. I'm seeing if we can weather the storm, and as we heard earlier about those great bills that are going to be presented, that Congress is at least going to address, is that there are opportunities for venues to get some relief. As you may know, I was involved with a couple of those virtual concerts that happened that were Colorado-centric. I co-hosted one with Brett Saunders, and then I performed a couple songs on another one with my wife, Helen. Anyway, those two things raised $1.2 million, I think, for Colorado music workers and some restaurant workers. But so in a way, the community is stronger and coming together, and the sense of competition and that sort of dog eat dog music business stuff is really in the rearview mirror now. So there are some positives that are in the midst of all this stuff. And sorry if that's a long-winded answer, but eTown has always been about more than just the music. It's music plus conversation, plus highlighting stories of people who are doing great things in their communities on behalf of large problems. And I always wanted to make sure we could demonstrate that individuals can make a difference. And so now we all have a chance to demonstrate that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's wonderful. Some of the things you've pivoted into, I've really enjoyed watching, Teach Me One Thing.
Right.
With Billy Strings and some of my favorite people just doing, Sarah Jarosz doing, very different things other than what you usually see them doing. So I appreciate those novel creative ideas, and hopefully that's inspiring to some other venue owners and people who are holding these spaces and have the gig workers that aren't, being utilized in their normal capacities to try and provide them with new creative ideas and generate new options for them. So I love seeing those. Yeah.
I mean, I think there's we're all getting a little zoomed out. We're all getting a little live music from closed venues with no audiences. We've seen a lot of that stuff, and we will continue to support our friends and our colleagues in whatever way we can. If it's filling the tip jar when they're playing their new song from their bedroom in their pajamas, we'll do it if that's what it. But I think to your point, there is an opportunity to innovate. And the Teach Me One Thing series was just, I didn't want to just call my friends and say, hey, how are you doing?
Yeah.
I figured, it'd be nice if I could call these people and say, hey, we're all sitting around, you're sitting around, stuff I don't know, teach me something. And I was really lucky to get a local guy to do some animation. There's been some claymation and some different ways they've animated the thing. But yeah, to have Steve Martin teach me how to shuffle a deck of cards, or Billy Strings teach me something on the guitar, or Sarah Jarosz talk to me about how to make sourdough starter.
Yeah.
That's just a pivot, right? That's just a way to share my access with my circle of friends. And but anybody can do stuff like that. It's not easy to do it well. And for most of us who are limited to our homes and our computers and our phones, we have to be extra creative to think about ways to make that happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think also the importance that you put on utilizing your global platform. I think, instead of kind of just being more self-serving, I think you've provided opportunities and used what you've created and generated to try and bring opportunities to other people. The Live Music Society, I think, it's just an incredible opportunity for smaller venues. Can you share with us about that participation you have there?
I got to know this guy, Pete Muller, a friend of mine. He's historically bi-coastal between California and New York, but he's a numbers guy by nature. He's a math nerd, and he turned that into a very successful investment firm that he's run for years, and I think he has 200 employees, and he's really good in the world of investments, and I'm terrible at that. So, and I didn't ask him to teach me about it. But anyway, he's good at that. He's made a lot of money, but he's also a serious musician. He's a piano player, songwriter. He has a band. He's done some touring, limited touring, predominantly small venues. And he recognized that small venues are really a fundamental part of the creative ecosystem, not just in each community, but nationally. And he really saw that even before the pandemic, that there was an opportunity to support small venues. And I think the definition that he came up with of the kinds of places that he was most concerned about were rooms that held, between 50 and 250 people, and that were predominantly listening rooms. And so that I know that takes a lot of, the Birchmere, for example, in Alexandria, where I've played a million times, that's too big, right? That's and bigger venues that make robust contributions to their community and their local economy, many of them rely on liquor sales, or they rely on private events or other things to keep them going. Those aren't the ones that Pete was concerned about, and it's predominantly because he hasn't, in his career, he hasn't played those kinds of venues. He's playing small rooms.
Yeah, I mean, I think that niche is not going to be very well supported with some of the congressional stuff that we've seen coming through. So I think it's an important niche to support, especially.
Yeah, and I mean, again, his desire, just to put it in context, is nowhere. His desire to help is not going to be sufficient to save the preponderance of small venues around the country. But just to give you a little background, the applications are up on the website, Live Music Society website, and the grants, I think they range from $5,000 or $10,000 to $50,000, and Pete is committed to putting up $1 million his first year to support small venues, and this is just his own cash. He's looking hopefully that he can continue this, and this will be an annual fund that will be available to rooms of this kind. And I know that this year so far, I believe the application deadline is September 1st. And they've already gotten about 100 venues have applied already. Only about half of those meet the criteria for one reason or another. And of those 50 venues, probably half of them will get some funding. So it's not a sure thing that anybody's going to get the dough, but the idea is that there's 20, 25, 30 venues that are going to get some substantial financial relief at a time when they really need it. And just candidly, his original concern and his original desire was, I want to help these clubs do the thing they've never been able to afford. Like, I need a new website. I need to put a bathroom near my dressing room. I need to upgrade my PA system. I need to hire a marketer. I need a new lighting board, that kind of stuff. And of course, now it's just like survival. It's like, what can we do to help these venues literally pay their rent, make their mortgage payments, solve the waiting game while we wait for this thing to open up.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder, if you didn't have this thing going on, this COVID situation, where would you be spending your time? I mean, I think it's wonderful to work through the Live Music Society. Where would you have been right now had we not been in this pandemic?
Me personally?
And eTown and, the business and...
Well, the reality is, Dani, that, kind of what we've been talking about the pivot, right? We've been talking about how we adapt. And so I'm being forced to make some changes that I think are going to really be helpful for eTown. So in the long run, on October 1st, we're launching our new season of eTown shows, in which I am literally going to be interviewing my musical guests, but I'm going to be playing their records. They're not going to be playing live in my venue. And I got to that decision after thinking about all these other permutations of how I might be able to capture the show, the content for the show. But I realized that if I put my house band in our studio and I said, okay, Lucinda Williams, which songs do you want us to learn from your new record? We'll send you the tracks. You add your vocals at your home studio. You send it back to us. We'll have a thing and we'll make our own music together. It's fundamentally disrespectful of the fact that she just went through all this with her own band, went in the studio, made a record, was happy with her vocal performances, mixed it, mastered it. And frankly, there's not much she can do with that. She can't tour behind the record. Not a lot of people are just buying records anyway. And so this is a way for me actually to respect my peers and my friends and my colleagues and my heroes who go through still that exercise of writing songs, going to the studio, recording and making records. And then I can actually talk to them about why this song, how this song, what they made, what the choices they made in the studio. And so it'll change the tenor of our conversation. One thing that I'm insisting on, though, is I still want to have two original pieces of content. One is a stripped down, live from home, acoustic guitar and vocal, just, what do you got? And then the other is, we've always had the finale at the end of our shows where we have two artists who typically don't know each other and don't come from the same universe. We've had an opportunity for them to play a song together that they literally, we all figured out, we'll give everybody about 45 minutes to find a song, pick a key, find an arrangement, and rehearse it. And then that's what we do. So it's like real life, real time creativity. And I think we can still do that in COVID times, picking a song. I might actually ask our listeners to help choose the song that the artists are going to do, and then go in the studio and make it happen remotely. So we'll still have some original, fresh content, plus the interviews. And frankly, as I was talking about before, this moment of social upheaval and sort of coming to terms with our racist past and how we treat each other. I think that gives us an opportunity with eTown to raise our game in terms of our reporting and our content creation for a radio show, and really think about what stories we want to tell and how we want to tell them, using sound design, using field reporting, using great journalism techniques. So I think the show it'll still feel like eTown, but it's going to be different. And that's my challenge, but it's also, I think, super exciting. And we wouldn't be doing it were we not in this place where we can't do shows in front of a live audience.
Dani, I'd like to jump in if you don't mind, because
Sure.
Nick, over the last couple of months, we've had a lot of conversations about non-commercial radio, and we've talked to KXP, we've talked to Radio Milwaukee, we've had WWOZ, we've really been across the country highlighting the role of non-commercial radio in our musical landscape. And I'm so interested by what you're just talking about in terms of it's not a hard pivot per se, but it feels like we're at this really interesting transition time with old sort of distribution models or legacy distribution models and affiliates, and everybody tune in at 7:00 or whenever it is, it's broadcast live. And then we've got the on-demand and podcasts and other technologies, and of course the pivot towards video. And it seems like the last couple of months have been a really complicated time for public media, because the kind of scare headlines are that the economic model is collapsing because we're losing commuters, and that's a lot of the economics of the public radio whole ecosystem have been based on ad dollars or sponsorship dollars connected to commuters and amassing ears, which has gone away. But at the same time, we all know that as everybody's been home, it feels like the intensity of the personal relationship with our favorite stations is growing. And it's this weird sort of, collision point. And I'm just wondering, again, this is a quasi-unfair question to, what's the future of public media? That's not exactly the question, but just as you think about it from an eTown standpoint, and again, with your dual mission around music, but also around the environment and sort of highlighting leadership and providing platforms, if we have a restart with public media over the next 10 years, where would you like to see that? Like, what does that next evolution look like from your standpoint? Or do you have any thoughts about what that could be looking like?
Well, I can't obviously speak globally, because the fundamental nature of public media and community radio and so on is community, and every community has its own range of choices and stations that serve those communities in different ways. I can tell you that being home, I'm listening to a lot more local radio than I used to. So when I was riding my bicycle to eTown Hall from my house, I have like a ridiculously pleasant commute, but I'm not a drive time radio listener. And when I'm at my office, I typically didn't have the radio on. But so when I'm working from home now, I find that I have a much more enhanced and a deeper relationship to my local public radio stations. And so I support them more. I think while the corporate underwriting may be going down because maybe advertising numbers are down or corporate marketing budgets are slashed, I believe that individual philanthropy is probably up. If you checked with all those stations, they would probably say that donations during pledge drives are probably higher than they have been in past years over the last few months. And, my hope is that it's not a zero-sum game where, this is the only way that everybody loses and nobody wins. I think it's just, this will be something else will come in to fill that gap in terms of funding. But I also think it's incumbent upon every public radio station to also re-examine and say, how am I serving my community? What can I do in terms of local engagement? What can I do in terms of responsiveness to the tenor and the mood of my hometown? And ultimately, you can't replace that with syndicated content or, just content that's not familiar with that immediacy of that community. So, I'm an optimist, and I'm a sap, and I'm a fan of public radio and fan of community radio. So I believe that in this age of everybody choosing, and it's a pull environment instead of a push environment, I still think there's a very important role for these radio stations to play. And I'm committed to doing what I can to help them, create those connections to their listeners and bring in revenue.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And, I'll give a quick shout out. We have a lot of Seattle area folks, always participate in this program. And we were fortunate to have Tom Morrow from KEXP on earlier this spring. And KEXP is, in the last 2 weeks has announced just a tremendous sort of rethinking of what does it mean for their station to be anti-racist, and they're really walking the walk in terms of their program design and leadership changes, and it's exciting, to kind of see even stations that many of us would hold up for being on the progressive and thoughtful end of things to really checking themselves in terms of what are their obligations and responsibilities.
Hey, we can all do better, right?
Yeah, okay.
We can all do better.
Speaking of local, I was also going to just ask what your thoughts were on potential for local bands and local musicians kind of maybe seeing a change in their ability to do more in this situation.
Jeez Louise. Dani, that's a tough question. I had my first socially distanced jam session in my backyard about a week ago. I did play a drive-in, and that was weird to play a drive-in, but it felt kind of like playing a gig where people could clap with their headlights and flashing their lights and stuff. In fact, I put up a URL somewhere in the chat room of one of these the songs from the drive-in show. My band called Del Shaman. I don't think for the most part, most of the people I talk to are really just struggling. Some people are doing more teaching online. Some people like Billy Strings are doing the occasional curated show from an empty venue and selling tickets for those. People are having to be creative to make things up, but it's sort of a triple whammy where, you don't have the record sales because people don't pay for music. You don't have that mailbox money you used to get. You don't have the gig income, and then you don't have the merch income from your gigs, which would also supplement your gig income. So it's just a terrible situation for touring musicians.
Right.
I think the last thing I'll say is that none of us got into playing music because we thought we were going to make a lot of money. We got into playing music because we were passionate about playing music. And we thought maybe we would, either, meet girls or have fun or go to festivals or whatever. But we played music primarily because we were deeply inspired by the music that we heard when we were growing up. And we put in the time to practice and to learn and to study and to get better. And that is continuing. So everybody I know who's a professional touring musician is learning, and they're at home, they're practicing, they're writing, they're taking the time to get better and to get inspired by listening. Now that doesn't pay the rent, that doesn't keep the lights on. And that's a real concern. because a lot of, depending on your history, whether you were in, somebody's support band, or whether you were a studio player, or whether you were just picking up gigs and you played in 5 different bands in your hometown, those are not typically easy ways to get unemployment and federal benefits, because you cobble together your income from a variety of different sources. So I have a lot of empathy, and if there's ways that we can help people who are struggling, I certainly want to do this. Obviously, I'm on the board of another organization called Create Boulder that's trying to sort of galvanize philanthropy from both foundations and individuals around the city of Boulder, Colorado, specifically to help arts organizations and artists of all disciplines get through this pandemic, and in general just bring more focused philanthropy into the community on behalf of artist gig workers. So I'm just trying to think about ways that I can help aim dollars and encouragement and support and solidarity to everybody who's struggling. And it's a drop in the bucket, but I'm going to try.
Thank you so much for all your efforts, and thank you for today. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, no, Dani, thank you. And Nick, thank you so much. For those of you watching today that have not had a chance to go down the eTown rabbit hole, I really encourage you to follow those links that Alex has put in the chat. eTown is a very, very special program. And, just really thinking about that intersection of cultural continuity, of new voices, of highlighting inspirational stories, giving us a window into a future that is a little bit different than the future it feels like we're heading down sometimes. It's a great, not just a program, but the entire, everything that Nick and his whole network and team put together is really special. So Nick, thanks for joining us. Dani, thanks for leading this. And
thanks a lot.
Yeah, appreciate it. And Cindy Lou, are you with us, Cindy? I think I see you there.
Hi, yes, I'm trying to get my videos started, I think.
There you go. You missed the beginning of the show where I couldn't get my microphone working, so there you go.
The age of COVID technical issues.
Zoom burnout and all the rest of it. So, and I'm also welcoming Anna Celenza, our co-founder of Music Policy Forum and host of today's Zoom. So Cindy, we're so happy you're with us. And again, for our audience, what we've been really trying to do over the last 5 months is really showcase a whole range of perspectives across the whole music ecosystem, and really check in with people in terms of not only what are they doing now in response to the shutdown, but what were they doing before? Where do they kind of fit in this whole complicated Zynga tower or Jenga tower that we all live in? And Cindy, why don't I'm going to let you introduce yourself a little bit in terms of your day-to-day work with Park Avenue Artists, but we are thrilled to have you on representing a perspective we haven't had on the show really that much in terms of artist management.
Oh, thanks so much, Michael, for having me. And I'm really grateful to be able to have this space to talk through these issues. So like Michael mentioned, I work in artist management in New York City, though I'm not in the city right now. And the agency that I work at is called Park Avenue Artists. And we have a roster that's very wide-ranging in terms of talent. And we have been kind of navigating through these times in a really, I think, innovative and adaptive way. So I'm really grateful to our artists for kind of being able to pivot and being open-minded, and we kind of have followed suit. And really just learning more about this all the different aspects of this ecosystem that have allowed it to be what it has been in the past and how it can look in the future.
So just on a very basic level, how would you describe the role of a manager? Like, what does a manager do? Not, again, pre-COVID. So what was your year going to be like if we had to have this mess this year in terms of the shutdown?
Yeah, so managers are essentially kind of the ones who guide an artist's career trajectory, whether that's long-term or short-term, and sort of guide all of their business opportunities. So we kind of shepherd them through performance opportunities as well as recordings and brand collaborations, artistic collaborations, and really anything that they feel inclined to do artistically to really help them put their work out into the world. And I think in addition to that, we also have a very humanistic and personal role of recognizing them as emotional and full human beings, and they're not simply commodities in a system that tends to seek to commodify everything in our capitalist markets. So I think that's another very integral part of our work. And it's really also sometimes being a middle person between our colleagues in the presenting world, in the live venue world, and with our artists.
Yeah, something that we talk a bunch about at Music Policy Forum is the importance of a team, and the sort of historic arc that many artists went through a long time ago, around the turn of the century, when it became clear that digital tools were making it possible to do things that historically may not have been that easy to do. So you could build your own website, you could book your own tour, you could use email and other communications tools to manage relationships with venues. You could, as social media evolved, you could be your own social media manager and all that. And then a lot of artists were finding, that was taking them off mission, because all the energy for a lot of people that they're putting into all those other competencies were taken away from their core job, which, depending on the artist, is, potentially composing or writing music, playing shows, making records, etc. But I think the other piece, which I'd love for you to speak to, is as the business has become more and more complicated, it's sort of exhausting to navigate, like, what choices can you make as an artist, and how do you put yourself in position to be viable economically? And where do you, again, what are the trade-offs? So can you speak a little bit about, and you touched on this, but go a little bit deeper in terms of the artists that you work with, like that mentoring aspect, and that sort of feeling like we're on the same team, navigating what is often a complicated and sometimes a little bit of a toxic industry.
I'm really glad that you reminded me of that point. It's really the primary role of management, I believe, is to allow the artists to do what they do the best, which is be creative and really put out their art. And essentially our primary role is to facilitate that. And in terms of, I guess, guiding them through a, as you said, at times very toxic or very overwhelming industry, I think it's really spending time to really get to know them on a more personal level, because when you get to know their preferences and their beliefs on whether certain opportunities are worth pursuing or not, you can sort of help better vet things that come their way, or filter out a lot of, I guess, opportunities that, may or may not align with who they are or what they want to be, or their artistic ethos in that sense. So, and in a way, a lot of management involves protection, I think, like sort of protecting the artist from, whether that's in a monetary sense, like protecting them from deals that undercut them or put them in a disadvantaged position. And also, I guess, protecting our colleagues in the presenting industry in terms of, advocating for what artists deserve, and I guess as integral parts of this ecosystem, what they can contribute to that world. Yeah.
Yeah, and something I think is interesting about the artists that you work with, which is a little bit of a different shading in the conversations we've been having. We've talked a lot over the last couple of months about independent venues and rock clubs and places, that are performing, that are presenting hip hop and things like that. And you tend to represent a clientele that has a little bit more of a mix in terms of nonprofit presenters, universities, sort of major institutional presenters like Kennedy Center, et cetera. And could you speak a little bit to that dynamic of working both in the kind of commercial marketplace, and then in the, it's not a non-com, it's a quasi-commercial marketplace, I guess, in terms of some of those other, government-sponsored or publicly funded presenters?
So definitely equate it with wearing many different hats. I think tone and communication is so important, because, representing the same artist to different live presenting partners can look very different depending on, as you said, the size of that or nature of that presenter. And I think it's really about as we take time to learn about the artists, we need to take also time to understand what our colleagues on the presenting side, what their goals are, and how we can help them achieve them. And I think it's really about that balance that is at play, no matter what the institution is, but it sort of takes on different flavors, if you will, depending on whether it's a university or a nonprofit or government funded or more commercial and kind of bigger scale. So I think it's very edifying for me, particularly to learn about all the different personalities that are at play and kind of what each entity ultimately wants and what they are kind of after.
Well, we're going to bring Anna Celenza in a minute and talk a little bit about 2022 and the future and the big reset and what we'd like this world to look like if we were making the decisions. But before we get to that, one of the reasons we're so excited to have you on is that you've been part of a really, really interesting organizing effort called PAMAC, the Performing Arts Managers and Agents Coalition, which basically emerged a couple months ago, not that long ago, basically out of a recognition that there was a perspective that really wasn't being kind of reflected in the existing advocacy infrastructure. Could you talk a little bit about PAMAC and what y'all are up to and how people can plug into that work?
Yeah, you give a great summary of what PAMAC is, but I am a member of it along with Charlotte Lee, who's my colleague, and she and my colleague David Lai have been working on advocacy efforts in terms of our group, our coalition. We have 250 plus independent artist management agencies and booking agencies as well as producers, but also really on behalf of the art sector as a whole in our country. We want to emphasize that this is an ecosystem like we have been talking about, and that any one part really is coexisting in this kind of synergy with every other aspect. I think one thing that you saw in this domino effect of COVID on our arts industry is that when one part of it started to crumble, everything else it was an inevitability, like that they would follow suit. It was just a matter of when. And I think our coalition's efforts really hope to highlight that what we're advocating for in terms of our Senate to legislate for COVID-specific arts relief is really on behalf of not just musicians, not just management, not just independent producers or anything, but really like the entire ecosystem that's at play.
Yeah. So could you speak a little bit about how what is it meant to engage people? So if people are interested in engaging with your work, what are the tools that you're using? How do they, what would that be practically speaking? So if someone goes to the website that Alex put into the chat, what would they see and what are you hoping people can do to intersect with your work?
So you might see a few things. Firstly, on the About page that is linked in the chat, you'll see what our appeal is to Congress. 3 points regarding the EIDL loans, PPP, and PUA. And these are kind of our top 3 that need to be addressed, hopefully, fingers crossed, in Congress. Because currently the unemployment benefits are set to expire, federal unemployment benefits are set to expire next week. And it's very clear that, this is not like a few months of crisis. This is a whole year for our industry. And there's no way that a lot of businesses that make up this sector are going to survive in any shape or form if we don't have federal support. So that's one thing you'll see. You'll also see a link to our change.org petition at the bottom, which also details a lot of our asks. Currently, I think we're at like 15,000 something signatures. It's been really great seeing a lot of solidarity and support expressed by not just members of our coalition, but a lot of their communities as well. And I think also if you hit the Take Action tab at the top, it takes you also to the petition. And I think there might be also a section to sign up for our mailing list. So that's actually where the most, I guess, like targeted advocacy in terms of reaching out to your senators, reaching out to your representatives on the local and state level really lies, because we sort of send instructions via mailing list to our coalition with sample scripts or things that they can advocate for. And we also have broken down every single member's zip code, so you can write your representatives directly.
And I think there are a couple of things I'd like to lift up here. One is thank you and congratulations to you and Charlotte and everybody, who have come together to help put this effort together. I think I think there are three major takeaways from my standpoint. I think the first is, again, when we talk about the federal funding dynamic, and for better or for worse, I've been around this stuff in DC for longer than I'd like to admit, and it's a challenge sometimes in the creative sector to get our head around the fact that that money is going to be spent. Like they are going to spend, likely between 1.5 and $2 trillion. And that money is going to be spent on those people who show up to make the argument about why they need to get resourced. And there's no shame in that process of letting your elected officials know this is the reality of what our situation is right now. And if you are investing resources or stimulus funding or relief funding, we need to be part of that conversation. And the worst thing they can do is say, we don't think you deserve money, but the downside of not engaging in that process is, again, that they're not going to just volunteer it and say, oh, great, let's put this money into the creative sector just for fun. They're just not going to do it. So one is, this whole notion of showing up is amazing. The second thing that you all have done, which is really impressive, is you basically scanned the advocacy ecosystem and you said, there's a perspective here that is not being represented, that we have a particular niche here as artist managers that is not necessarily being prioritized in the other institutional players, which doesn't mean they're doing a bad job. It just means they're focusing on their knitting. Like NEVA is focusing on independent venues. And so for y'all to start, and you started small, and then you got the word out to your network, and then you had 250 agencies on board within like a month. And that's really impressive because that gives you scale, and it gives you the opportunity to do targeted messaging to your community, which then helps them, resource them so they can feel like they're taking action. The third thing that you're doing, which I think is really impressive that I really want to hold up, is that then, you're not just out there saying, we need the, $15 million, targeted artist manager support fund. You're saying, where do we fit into the broader advocacy ecosystem? Say, okay, if we're bringing to bear this network of experts that have bandwidth and expertise and can help, how does that align with what other people are doing so we have strength in numbers? And I think it's a really important lesson that that your team, my sense is, that you've been very pragmatic and strategic in terms of how are you amplifying other efforts so we're all building together, and it's not just like a totally just uncoordinated, just everybody just bouncing into walls. So I just think for our viewers, I really encourage you to dig in to what they're doing at PAMAC, to see if that's the organization that, if you are still looking for an organization to represent sort of where you fit in the community, that may well be a fit. But certainly, amplify what they're doing, pass the word along to, managers, musicians who are on today's meeting. If your manager is not involved, or if your agency that works with you is not involved in this effort, make sure it's on their radar screen. So anyway, that's a long speech, and I apologize for that. But I just think it really, I think it's really, we talk a lot in this program about, how 2020 is just such a disastrous bummer on every level, but there are things that we can really hold up and feel good about. And I think the sort of emergence of this activism, grassroots activism, and engagement with the policy process in the music sector has been something that we really are encouraged by. And it gets to the part, and I'd like to bring you in now, to think about the future. We think about this reset, and we think about this infrastructure and the power that we're building, and we all collectively understand the need to have better structures and different leadership and approach this stuff differently. And so, and I don't know if you have a question at this point, or
I actually do have a quick question, and I would to kind of build off of what you just said about how it's a bummer year, and it's very easy to quickly go to the things that are the problems. But I'm wondering, have there been any revelations or things you've learned that you went, oh, actually, once we get through all this, this was a good lesson to learn, or this is something to think about my business in a new way? I wonder if there's anything like that for you, Cindy.
Mm-hmm.
Great question. Well, I guess nothing new really on the table, but just kind of things that have always existed and now we've sort of removed the veil from, so to speak, whether that's in terms of real community engagement. Like it cannot be just ending at outreach. That's just not good enough. And if anything, our society, we place monetary value on things that we value culturally. And even when we didn't have a pandemic, it's not like the arts were quote unquote thriving, and it's not like they could not have benefited from federal support. So now it's sort of like all of these issues, like the way that the pandemic has disproportionately affected Black and Brown communities in the US, is like it's sort of just made all of this more amplified, and we can't look away anymore. I think that has been the sort of biggest realization that our industry is facing. And I think it sort of also shines a light on how there's so many processes and infrastructures that were not really serving our communities before. And now is the perfect time to really hone in on those and really change for the better, because if not now, then, when are we going to do it?
Yeah, definitely. And your agency, by the way, you have an amazing list of folks that you represent. I went down the rabbit hole of watching all these videos and things today. So that's really wonderful. I would say in general, I saw sort of three big groups. So there are classical, like Joshua Bell, classical performers, and also Broadway performers, and then singer-songwriters. And I'm wondering, are you as a manager noticing differences of how sort of those three different segments of the performance ecosystem are dealing with the pandemic? And I'm thinking, unions with orchestras versus unions with, Broadway theaters. And I'm just curious if you've noticed any differences genre connected.
Wow, I love these questions you're asking. I think, well, on the classical side, it's kind of been this like wake up call that there's so many ways that the classical world sometimes doesn't intersect with technology and doesn't intersect with streaming, and so much so that there have to be specific streaming services created for classical music, which personally I think is a little counterproductive. Like maybe we should be advocating for everyone who's already on Spotify and on Apple Music to give them resources to better understand or approach classical. But that's sort of one thing that I've seen in that genre is like really just going all in terms of experimenting with live streaming, experimenting with how you really cannot replicate a live experience via the internet. So what can we do to innovate and to really create essentially what is a new form of consuming music? In terms of Broadway, I have really loved artists sort of doing duets or like calling on their followers of all ages to kind of sing along with them. And they have been also leading amazing advocacy efforts in terms of federal support. Like a few of our partners in our coalition are very involved in Broadway, like the Broadway League, as well as Extend PUA. And yeah, I guess in terms of maybe like the pop and R&B world, it's I think because that is a very also already digital and like streaming heavy genre and market, it's been more about kind of how we can leverage that existing relationship and I guess developing that even more.
Great, thanks.
So Cindy, I think you touched on this a little bit earlier, but I want to just unpack this a tiny bit more. One of the things that we're really interested in is this sort of generational handoff of power. And this notion that an industry which is increasingly digital, a lot of the decision making, happens, really comes through a lens of analog natives who, grew up and sort of internalized a music industry that is fundamentally bears little resemblance to not only the industry of today, but the industry of the future. And I would just love and I don't mean like, I hope this doesn't sound patronizing, but I think it's just really interesting that, you're fairly young. You've been out there for a while, but you're a young person with, showing a lot of leadership and a lot of vision in this community. And again, coming into the community with a fundamentally different relationship to technology, essentially as a digital native. You grew up with a different relationship to a digital music community that, again, would be very different than my generation would have. And I'm just curious about how are you seeing those generational dynamics taking place, especially at a leadership level, in terms of who really is making decisions about these future structures, and what does that look like? And is that something that you think you're optimistic about, or are you feeling like that's just still going to be a structural challenge, in terms of what's happened over the course of the music industry over time?
Another really great question. Well, this is something that I think about in my own work as well, is, as you were saying, this tension between those who are decision makers in our industry and who have extensive experience and expertise, and we really look up to them, versus it being a fundamentally cultural industry that demands relevance and it demands innovation and adaptation. And I do feel very fortunate that I have had the opportunity to work with leaders in our industry who are very open-minded, and they're not coming from like a castle in the sky kind of mindset. So I think maybe specifically for classical, this applies more, but kind of shedding this mindset of preservation and protection in the face of creativity and innovation. I think those two things are not mutually exclusive. I find it very fascinating how history is so cyclical, in the sense that we now are like this preservation at all costs, like Beethoven must be always Beethoven forever. And it's like, well, it's not like when Beethoven first premiered his works that everybody loved them across the world, right? Like, I think it took time for us to lionize artists like that, and the same way that we continue to do so today. And I think just keeping in mind that this is a fundamentally fluid industry, and that's what makes it so great and what makes it so fascinating to be a part of. And I think also just understanding that this can be a very toxic and competitive industry, but ultimately, like, we're here because we love music. We're not here because we want to just wage culture wars all the time and cancel people. I think it also speaks to our larger political discourse as a country, but we need to learn how to not see things as immediately black and white, and kind of really approaching each person as a valid opinion that they hold, and kind of comparing what we think to that, instead of just, everything that someone says that I don't agree with is automatically just canceled and I don't like that or something.
Great answer. That's a great answer. Well, and that's a great way to close out today's program, I think. So, Cindy, we so appreciate you joining us, and congratulations for all your work at PAMAC. Again, everybody should check it out at artsrelief.org. And Anna, thank you as always for joining us. We love your
pleasure. I always love these shows.
Nick Forster, Dani Grant, thank you so much for joining us earlier today. Our producer, Alex Dolvin, always making things go smoothly. Oh, Dani's got a doggy. As always, this show will go up on YouTube over the weekend, and we'll share the link. Please feel free to distribute it to friends and colleagues that you think would find this interesting. We'll be back next Friday with our program, and then we're going to take a couple weeks off in August and recharge and think about new things to talk about. But thanks to everybody. Hit us up as always with questions, comments, ideas, musicpolicyforum@gmail.org. Thanks again. Have a great rest of your Friday.